Sheila Anderson was born in approximately 1955 or 1956 in the Scottish borders. That stretch of southern Scotland where the hills roll gently toward the English border, where the communities are small and the families are close and the pace of life is unhurried. She grew up in that world. She was, by every account of those who knew her in those years, a bonny young woman, warm, capable, full of life. As a teenager, she had ambitions. She wanted to be a nurse. She wanted to do something that mattered, something that helped people. It was not an unreasonable dream for a girl growing up in the borders in the 1970s. It was the kind of aspiration that said something about her character, about the person she was before the world did to her what it did. She married in her late teens. By the time she was 20, she'd given birth to her first child. A second followed not long after. She was a young mother with a family and a life that, from the outside at least, looked like exactly what she had been reaching for. Those who knew her in those years described her as happily married, settled, doing well. The nursing dream had not been realized, but she had her children and her husband and a future that still felt open. Then, heroin arrived. In the early 1980s, the first major wave of heroin swept through Scotland, through Edinburgh in particular, with a speed and devastation that the authorities were wholly unprepared for. It was cheap. It was abundant. It gave, in the words of former Deputy Chief Constable Tom Wood, who would later serve on the investigation into Sheila's murder, tremendous highs. And it was ferociously addictive. Within months of being introduced to it, a person could lose everything: their relationships, their children, their sense of themselves, their future, to a substance that demanded complete and total loyalty above all else. Sheila Anderson was introduced to heroin. Within months, she was hooked. Her family fought to reach her. They tried everything they could. Despite their desperate efforts, she slipped away. Nothing mattered except the drug. She became estranged from her husband. She left the Scottish borders. She moved to Edinburgh. She ended up living in a drug squat in the city, as far from the rolling hills and the close-knit community of her childhood as it was possible to get. Edinburgh in those years had been transformed by heroin in ways that affected every part of the city, but nowhere more visibly than Leith, the port area on the Firth of Forth that had alwaise been the rougher, harder edge of the capital. The sex industry in Leith had changed almost overnight. The experienced, streetwise women who had worked there for years had been replaced in the space of 6 months by a new generation. Young, vulnerable, drug-dependent women who were there for one reason only: to make enough money to feed a habit that could cost as much as £100 a day. Prices had fallen to £2 or £3. The women were unprotected and easy to exploit. Sheila Anderson was one of them. She was what Tom Wood later called one of the first generation of accidental prostitutes. She had not chosen this life. Heroin had chosen it for her. She worked the streets of Leith as a casual sex worker to fund her addiction. She was known among those who worked the same streets. She was known to be confrontational. If a client refused to pay, she would stand in front of his car and refuse to move until he did. She was a woman who had not entirely given up on herself, even when everything around her said she should. But the streets of Leith in 1983 were not a place that rewarded that kind of defiance. On Thursday, 7th of April 1983, Sheila Anderson was seen at various points during the day in the West Granton and Leith areas of Edinburgh. She was 27 years old. Her 2 sons, aged 7 and 2, were living without her. At around 11:30 that night, 2 police officers on patrol in Commercial Street in Leith saw her. She was talking to a man. That was the last confirmed sighting of Sheila Anderson alive. At approximately 11:54 that night, 2 CB radio enthusiasts near the Granton foreshore in North Edinburgh came across a young woman lying on waste ground at a place called Gypsy Brae. They contacted the emergency services. A patrol car arrived within minutes. An ambulance followed. Sheila was taken to the Western General Hospital. She was declared dead on arrival. A post-mortem confirmed that Sheila Anderson had died from multiple injuries consistent with being deliberately run over and dragged by a heavy motor vehicle, possibly more than once. The investigators who examined the scene and the forensic evidence formed a clear picture of what had happened. Sheila had likely confronted a client who refused to pay. She had done what she was known to do, stood in front of his car, and he had driven at her. Forensic examination of the scene established that the killer's car had been painted red. The vehicle would have sustained very heavy damage in the attack. Investigators knew that the driver could not simply have parked a badly damaged red car and gone about his life without questions being asked. Police appealed publicly for anyone who remembered a partner or acquaintance arriving home in April 1983 in a heavily damaged red car to come forward. A post-mortem also established that there was a 50% chance the killer had contracted a sexually transmitted infection from Sheila and would have needed to seek medical treatment. Officers appealed to anyone whose partner had sought treatment for such a condition around that time. On Sunday 10th of April, 1983, 3 days after the murder, Sheila's handbag was found near a car park on the road heading south from Edinburgh toward England. The location of the bag told investigators something important. Whoever had killed Sheila Anderson had not stayed in Edinburgh. They had driven south. They may have come from England and gone back to England. It was a detail that widened an already enormous inquiry. The murder investigation was led by Detective Chief Inspector Jimmy Wilson. Tom Wood served on the initial murder squad. Officers conducted hundreds of interviews. They traced vehicles, they canvassed witnesses, they followed every lead the evidence gave them. Despite the scale of the investigation, the driver of the red car was never found. The case went cold. What Sheila's murder did, beyond the grief it caused, beyond the injustice of it, was change things. The killing forced a reckoning within Lothian and Borders police about how they dealt with sex workers on the streets of Edinburgh. The aggressive policing of the Leith area had driven women away from established patches and made it harder for them to protect themselves and each other. Sheila's death made it clear that this approach was not working, that vulnerable women were paying for it with their lives. Tolerance zones were established. A different approach to policing the sex industry was adopted. Tom Wood said later, "We recognized then that public safety had to take precedence over criminal justice. It was a significant shift in how Scotland policed its most vulnerable citizens. The case that brought it about had not been solved, but it had not been without consequence." In 2009, 26 years after the murder, forensic scientists built a full DNA profile from material connected to the case. It was loaded onto the national database. Appeals were made. BBC Crime Watch covered the case. The profile has never matched anyone. On the 40th anniversary of the murder in April 2023, Police Scotland renewed their public appeal for information. Detective Chief Inspector Brian Geddes of the Homicide Governance and Review Team said the murder remained unresolved but was subject to continued review. Tom Wood, now long retired but still carrying the case, wrote in The Scotsman. He said Sheila Anderson had fallen victim twice in her short life, once to heroin and once to the man who killed her. He said the key to a cold case was to keep it warm. He said all you need is that name. He said his hope was that one day he would get a knock on the door and someone would tell him they had got him. On the night of Sunday 10th of January 1971, the Silver Butterfly Function Suite at the Muirton House Hotel in Perthshire was full. Approximately 50 to 60 guests had come out for the dinner dance, dressed up, settled at tables, out for the evening in the way that people in small Scottish towns had been coming out to the local hotel on a winter weekend for generations. The music played, people danced. The hotelier who owned the place moved among his guests, buying rounds, paying with the large wads of notes he always seemed to have about him. That was James Kelty. That was his place. He had built it, and he ran it, and he was proud of it. James Kelty was born in approximately 1918 or 19 in Perthshire, a county of mountains, river valleys, soft fruit fields, and small, close-knit communities sitting at the foot of the Grampian Mountains on the northern edge of the Strathmore Valley. He was a working man who understood the value of building something from nothing. Before the hotel, he had owned a fruit shop on Leven High Street in Fife. At some point in the early 1960s, he made a decision that would define everything that followed. He purchased the Muirton House Hotel in Perthshire, relocated his family, and threw himself into making the place work. His wife Agnes had been a policewoman with Fife Constabulary before the move. They had 3 children. James was 52 years old by January of 1971. He was not a man who delegated the important things. He handled the cash from the till himself at the end of every night. The exact amount he carried on any given evening was known only to him. He expanded the ballroom, transformed the hotel, and built the Silver Butterfly into a venue that people in the area looked forward to coming to. He was known as a big spender, often seen buying drinks for patrons and producing a large wad of notes to pay for them. He was liked. He was well known. He had made himself a fixture in the community he had chosen. The guests at the Silver Butterfly that Sunday night left at around 11:30 in the evening. The hotel fell quiet. James finished his duties. His wife Agnes said goodnight to him at around midnight and went to bed. They slept in separate bedrooms. She did not see him again. The following morning, Monday 11th of January 1971, a taxi driver named Dave Turpie arrived at the Muirton House Hotel at 8:15. He had come to collect the 3 Kelty children for school. The children were 5, 9, and 16 years old. When Turpie arrived, the hotel was quiet in a way that did not feel right. The children were nowhere to be found. He began to look around. In an upstairs bedroom, there were signs of a struggle. Turpie helped Agnes search the hotel and its grounds. They found James Kelty in the hotel garage, a building set approximately 80 yards from the bedroom where the attack appeared to have begun. He was in his underwear and string vest. He had been bound and gagged. He was drenched in blood. He had been beaten with sustained and savage violence and was unconscious on the garage floor. An ambulance was called. James was rushed to Dundee Royal Infirmary. He died on the way. The post-mortem confirmed a fractured skull had caused massive bleeding to the brain. The following day, a CID officer was photographed removing an iron bar from a field close to the hotel, believed to be the murder weapon. The case was described as the worst crime ever committed in Perthshire. The investigation that followed was the largest manhunt the county had ever seen. Officers worked through every lead available to them. The prevailing theory was that the killers had been professionals, not local men, but people who had planned the attack in advance, who may have attended the Silver Butterfly that very evening and watched and waited for their moment. James Kelty was known to carry cash. He alone knew how much was in the till. Whatever sum he had on him that night, it went with his killers. Others were not convinced it was robbery. They believed the attack was too deliberate, too organized, too sustained to be simply a raid that had spiraled out of control. Both theories were investigated. Both ran into walls. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. Agnes Kelty never recovered. The former policewoman, who had built a life with James in that hotel, died later in the 1970s, a few short years after his murder, without seeing justice done. Their 3 children grew up without their father. 3 years after the murder, a young man named Willie McFarlane joined Perth and Kinross Constabulary. The Kelty case was the first thing anyone talked about when he arrived. The unsolved killing that sat over the force like a question nobody could answer. Willie never worked the case directly, but it followed him. Through his career and into his retirement, he kept returning to it, kept turning it over in his mind, kept asking the questions that had never been satisfactorily answered. Why was James dragged 80 yards from the bedroom to the garage after the attack? If robbery was the motive, why go to the trouble of binding and gagging him and moving him at all? Where were the 3 children, the 5-year-old, the 9-year-old, and the 16-year-old, while their father was being beaten to death in his own hotel? And why, for years afterwards, did the name of Dave Turpie, the taxi driver who had simply arrived to take the children to school and made a terrible discovery, become associated with the case as though he were somehow implicated when he was plainly an innocent man who had the profound misfortune of being first through the door? In 2011, Willie published a book on the history of the Perthshire constabularies. He dedicated a chapter to the Kelty murder, branded in its pages as Blair Gorey's most dastardly crime. On the 50th anniversary of the killing in January 2021, he made a public appeal for information. He said, "Someone out there knows what happened to Mr. Kelty. This is one of the area's biggest murder cases, and yet the killer or killers have never been found." He said he believed only a deathbed confession could now resolve it. The murder of James Kelty remains officially unsolved. Hello everyone, thank you for listening and drop any feedback below. I would love to hear your thoughts and hope to see you again right here on Cold Case UK.